Hello everyone, welcome to my channel or welcome back. My name is Chris and here I'm sharing my journey with cross stitching. In today's video we'll take a look at a few different methods of starting and ending threads from the front of the fabric without having to flip it over to the back. You probably already know most of these methods since there are many tutorials on YouTube, but maybe you'll still find the video useful. Of course, these aren't all the methods out there, but I just chose the ones that I like. Different fabrics and counts may behave differently, so feel free to experiment and see what works best for you. I will be using 16 count Aida and 24 count Congress stramming in one case. One more thing to remember is that I always start my stitches in the bottom left hole, and that's what I will assume when demonstrating all of these methods. Here I would also like to mention the way I hide my parked threads. This is not really about ending threads, I just wanted to clarify something. In my second Flosstube video, I accidentally mentioned the wrong stitcher as the person from whom I learned this method. I've already removed that part of the video to avoid any confusion. I first noticed this way of hiding parked threads in one of Joyce's videos on the Stitchy Dachi channel. It was her video about gridding fabric. I hope Joyce won't mind me showing a screenshot from her video here, and of course I will link that video in the description below. What's funny is that I actually came across that video on YouTube completely by accident last year. I was searching something about gridding methods for transferring an image onto watercolor paper, so I was looking for something totally unrelated to stitching. But this video came up and the moment I saw it, I was immediately hooked. That video actually inspired me to come back to stitching. When I watched it, I thought, first of all, that it was such an amazingly organized way of stitching, which I absolutely loved. And second, when I saw those birds, it gave me that idea that I could turn my own paintings and illustrations into patterns and stitch them. So that's really where my stitching journey began. So this method of creating those vertical lines of threads, which I just called thread icicles, comes from Joyce and all the credits goes to her. Okay, now that I've explained that, we can move on to the main part of the video. Loop start is probably the most popular method when you're using an even number of threads. First, let's take a look at how the loop is created. If we take a single strand of floss or any number of single strands and put the two ends together, we create a fold on the opposite side, which becomes our loop. Here I'm using one strand folded in half, which now gives me two strands to work with. I thread the needle, leave a tail of around 2 inches or longer, and on the other end I now have that loop. I start my stitches in the bottom left hole, so my first leg normally goes from bottom left to top right. But when I use a loop start, I actually begin in the top right hole. First we go down in the top right corner and we leave the loop in the front of the fabric. Now we can come up through the bottom left hole as if we were starting a normal stitch, and don't pull the thread too tightly because we don't want to pull the loop through yet. Next, pass the needle through the loop and pull the thread. I like to pull almost perpendicular to the fabric surface. Now you can see that we've cut the loop. At this point we can finish the first leg by going down either through the bottom left hole where we normally start the stitch, or through the top right hole where the loop is. Personally, I like going down through the bottom left hole. It doesn't matter which hole you choose, and I will show you why in just a moment. So I go down through the bottom left hole and notice that the loop gets pulled underneath the fabric and hidden there. Now the first leg is finished and I can complete the stitch normally by making the second leg. Now let's do the loop start once again. I go down in the top right, then come back in the bottom left, I catch the loop, and this time I will go down in the top right hole. Gently pull the thread underneath the fabric to hide the loop. As you can see, the result is exactly the same, and now I can finish the stitch. Now let me show you why it doesn't matter whether you pull the loop through the bottom left or top right hole. With this coral thread, I will make the first leg of a stitch using the loop start method, and I will pull the loop through the bottom left hole. This is what I normally do. Then I will park the thread a few stitches away. Now below that, with this olive green thread, I will do the same thing, but this time I will pull the loop through the top right hole. I'll also park this thread a few stitches away. Now if we look at the back side, you'll notice that there is no difference between these two methods. In the first example, the thread catches the loop and brings it to the back side, and you can see now that the thread secures the loop. If we look at the olive green stitch, it looks exactly the same. There is no difference whatsoever, so in this case, it really doesn't matter which hole you choose, just use whichever feels more comfortable to you. For me, that's the bottom left. However, now let's move on to the modified loop start, and you will see that in that method, the hole you choose actually does make a difference. Now we are moving on to methods that work with any number of threads. So if you're working with a single strand or with two strands but no longer have a loop because you already used that color earlier and now need it in a different area, all of these methods will work for you. So here I have a threaded needle and there's no loop at the end. I could be using one strand or three strands, it doesn't matter. Now we're going to make a modified loop start. It's called modified because it still uses a loop, but not one created by folding the thread like in the previous example. First, go down through the top left hole. Pull the thread through, but leave a tail on top. We'll trim this tail in a moment. In this example, I'm starting directly in the stitch I'm about to make, but you can also start a few stitches away. Since we'll be trimming that tail anyway, the exact starting point doesn't matter. If you begin a few stitches away, you will leave a longer tail underneath the fabric, which adds a little extra security because future stitches will cover it. Now come up through the top right hole and then go back through that same top right hole. This is where our modified loop is created. Try to keep the loop untwisted. Next, come up through the bottom left hole, just like we did with the regular loop start. Then catch the loop, and this is where the important part comes in. With this method, we have to come back down through the same hole where the loop was created. So I go back down through the top right hole and give the thread a gentle tug to pull the loop underneath the fabric. And now we can finish the stitch. I like to bring my needle up through the bottom right hole and pause here, then I trim the tail we left at the beginning and finish the stitch. Now let me show you why it's important to pull the loop back through the same hole where it was created. I'm making the modified loop start exactly as before, but this time I want to go down through the bottom left hole instead. If you look closely, you'll notice that doing this creates a first leg with 4 strands instead of 2. I'll try to show you. Can you see that? That happens because this modified loop already contains 2 strands from the beginning, since the loop itself is formed from folded thread. So altogether we end up with 4 strands in the first leg. If I finish the stitch like this, that leg will look noticeably bulkier than a normal stitch. Now I'll make another stitch right next to it, but this time I'll do it the correct way by pulling the loop through the top right hole. Can you see the difference? On the right, we have a normal first leg with 2 strands, and on the left, we have a leg with 4 strands. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. This is probably my favorite way to start a thread because it's relatively quick. There are 2 ways to do it, so let's take a look at the first one. First, go down through the top left corner of the stitch you want to make, although you can also start a few stitches away if you prefer. Leave a small tail that we will trim off later. Next, come up through the middle of the stitch. Then go down through the top right hole. And that creates our half diagonal pin stitch. From here you can continue stitching normally. So I will make the first leg of the stitch, then come up through the bottom right hole, pause in the middle, trim the tail, and finish the stitch. Now let's take a look at a slightly different version. Again, we start by going down through the top left hole, but this time we come up either through the top right hole or bottom left hole. I'll come up through the top right hole. Next, go down through the middle of the stitch, and that creates the half diagonal pin stitch. Now we can make the first leg of the stitch as usual, starting from the bottom left. Then we finish the stitch normally. I come up through the bottom right hole, pause in the middle, trim the tail, and finish the stitch. So this is essentially a modified, shorter version of a full diagonal pin stitch. So now let's move on to that one. A diagonal pin stitch can be done in a few different ways. I will show you 3 methods. In the first method, we start the same way as with the half diagonal pin stitch. We go down through the top left hole and leave a short tail. Then we come up through the middle of the stitch. Next we go down through the top right hole. At this point we have a half diagonal pin stitch. So far everything is exactly the same as in the previous method, but now we continue a little differently. We come up through the bottom left hole and then go down again through the middle of the stitch. This creates another half diagonal pin stitch, and together they form the first leg of the stitch. From here we can finish the stitch normally. So I come up through the bottom right hole, pause in the middle, trim the tail, and finish the second leg of the stitch. In all of these methods, when you trim the tail, you leave a tiny end in the top left hole, which gets pushed back underneath the fabric when you complete the second leg. Now let's take a look at the second version. Again, we go down through the top left hole and leave a short tail. But this time, instead of coming up through the middle, we come up through the top right hole. Then we go down through the middle of the stitch. Next, we come up through the bottom left hole and go down through the middle again. This creates our diagonal pin stitch, which forms the first leg of the stitch. From there, we can finish the stitch normally. Finally, let's take a look at the third version, which is probably the most popular one. It's very similar to the second method, but this time we begin by going down from the front to the back directly through the middle of the stitch we want to make, leaving a short tail on top. That's the only difference. In the second version we started in the top left corner, while here we start in the middle. Next we come up either through the top right hole or the bottom left hole. I'll come up through the top right hole, then we go back down through the middle again, and this creates the first half of the first leg. And now we can come up through the bottom left hole and once again go down through the middle. And this completes the first leg of the stitch, and at this point we can trim the tail. After that, we can finish the second leg of the stitch normally. Instead of a diagonal pin stitch, we can also start with a regular pin stitch, which is vertical or horizontal. Here we can see that the top threads of the fabric run horizontally, so the pin stitch will also be made horizontally, following those fabric threads. These horizontal threads are called weft, while the vertical ones are the warp. First we go down a couple of stitches away, and then we make a pin stitch in the spot where we want to place our stitch. So I pierce through the middle of the weft on the left side and go down through the middle on the right side. Of course, if the warp threads were on top, we would make a vertical pin stitch. From there we can make the stitch normally. Then we trim the tail. One more note here, when we start a few stitches away, we usually go down through a hole, but we could also go down through the middle of the fabric threads instead. In that case, when we trim the tail, there is a chance that the thread will be held in place by the fabric threads themselves. The idea behind starting a few stitches away in every case is that the thread tail will also be stitched over on the backside, which gives an extra level of security. The waist knot start was quite popular many years ago when I was stitching, but now I rarely use this method unless I'm feeling a little lazy and I want to make a very quick start. So to use this method, we first need to make a knot at the end of the thread, and here is how to do it. Once the needle is threaded, place the end of the thread on your finger, then place the needle perpendicular to the thread so that it crosses the thread, with the tip pointing upward exactly where you want the knot to be. Now hold the end of the thread and the needle in your left hand and grab the working thread with your other hand. Next, wrap the thread around the needle a few times. I usually wrap it 2 or 3 times, and the more wraps you make, the larger the knot will be. You can see that the thread is now wrapped around the needle, so now hold those wraps in place, push the needle through, and pull it all the way until you reach the end of the thread. The wrapped thread will slide down and create a knot exactly where you wanted it. Now go down a few stitches away, and instead of going through a hole, go down through the middle of a random stitch. We don't want to go through a hole if we use the parking method, because later you may need to park a thread in that same hole. So we don't want the hole to be occupied by the waist knot thread. If we go down through the middle of the fabric threads instead, all 4 surrounding holes remain empty and available for parking. At this point, the knot holds the thread securely in place, so there's no risk of it being pulled through. Now we can make a stitch straight away and continue stitching normally. While we stitch, the thread running from the knot to the first stitch will gradually be stitched over on the back side of the fabric. I think it's also worth mentioning that if you're stitching with a light colored thread and the waist knot thread is dark, this may not be the best method to use. There is a chance you could see a faint shadow of the darker thread underneath the lighter stitches, so that's something to keep in mind. As you continue stitching additional rows, the thread becomes buried under stitches on the back of the fabric. Once you get close to the knot area, you simply trim the knot off. At that point, the thread end is already secured underneath the stitches on the back, just as if you had flipped the work over and tucked the thread under existing stitches manually. Here I would also like to show you a different way of making a knot, as well as a quicker way to start stitching. This is called a micro knot because we create a very small knot at the end of the thread. It works well on high count fabrics where the holes are tiny. If the holes are larger, you may need to make a slightly bigger knot. Hold the end of the thread between your thumb and index finger, and then hold the thread a little farther down between your middle finger and ring finger. If you've ever done tutting, you may already be familiar with a similar hand position. Now place your needle on the thread and make a small turn to wrap the thread around the needle. Now you can slide the needle to position the knot exactly where you want it, and then pull the needle through. This creates a tiny knot at the end of the thread, hence micro knot. You can also make a larger knot with this method by wrapping the thread around the needle several times. Now you can simply make a stitch straight away, and the knot will hold the thread on the other side of the fabric. Of course, if you care a lot about having a very neat back, knots may drive you crazy, so this definitely isn't a method for everyone. Now we move on to methods for ending threads, and the pin stitch is probably one of the most popular ones. So let's say this is my last stitch and I want to end the thread. I go a couple of stitches away and choose an empty spot where I can make the pin stitch. Again, the fabric has vertical warp threads and horizontal weft threads, so we can make either a vertical or horizontal pin stitch. I'll start with the horizontal version. I pierced through the middle of the fabric threads on the left side and go down through the middle of the threads on the right side. The idea here is just to wrap the thread around the warp threads. Once the pin stitch is made, I come up through a nearby hole a few stitches away and cut the thread. The left to right direction is my preferred way of making pin stitches. For some reason I find it easier, probably because the hand position feels more natural and I can clearly see the area where I'm making the pin stitch. Next, let's make a vertical pin stitch. Here the hand position feels a little different and for me personally a bit less comfortable. In this case we pierce through the wrap threads and wrap around the weft threads instead. This method I've learned from Slow Stitch Yogi's video and I will link that video below. So here, after making a stitch, I need to end the thread. Because of the way I stitch from right to left, I like to come up through the bottom left hole. I think Yogi goes up in the bottom right. Now the idea is to tuck the thread underneath the stitch we just made by piercing through the middle of that stitch. You could say that we are making a half diagonal pin stitch underneath the stitch we just completed. From here I can either go down from the left side of the stitch or from the bottom side. Now here is something that I figured out and I personally do. I like to look at the stitch below and check which fabric threads are visible on top. Here I can see the weft threads on top, so they run horizontally. Can you see that? That means the fabric threads underneath my stitch run vertically, so it will be easier to slide the needle underneath them from the left side. In other words, if the visible threads below run horizontally, I also tuck the thread in horizontally under the stitch I just made. So I go underneath, piercing through the middle of the stitch, and normally I would come up a few stitches away and cut the thread, but here I'm just going to park it for the next stitch. Now let's take a look at the second example. Again, I make a stitch and want to end the thread, so I come up through the bottom left hole, and this time when I look at the stitch below, I can see the fabric threads running vertically. So now I pierce through the middle of the stitch from the bottom side instead. Normally I would come up a few stitches away and cut the thread, but here I will just continue stitching. Now let's take another look at what's actually happening with the thread when we use this method. Let's imagine that we've just made a stitch here, and I will visualize it as a transparent stitch. When I do a tuck-in ending, I come up through the bottom left hole and look at the stitch below. If I can see the top threads running horizontally from left to right, that means the fabric threads underneath my stitch run vertically. So in this case I make the tuck-in ending from the left side because it's easier to slide the needle end thread underneath those vertical fabric threads while piercing through the weft thread underneath. Now let's look at the second option. Again, imagine we've just made a stitch here, and this time when I look at the stitch below, I can see the warp threads on top. so they run vertically. So I come up through the bottom left hole and tag the thread underneath the stitch from the bottom side instead. This makes it easier to slide the thread underneath the weft threads that sit on top beneath the stitch I just made, while piercing through the warp threads underneath. Now Yogi also mentioned a great tip that I think is worth highlighting here because it makes a lot of sense. Instead of doing the tuck-in ending underneath the stitch we just made, it's better to do it a couple of stitches away, under a different stitch of the same or similar color. Let's take a look at an example. These techniques work especially well when stitching cross-country because when you stitch row by row, there are fewer opportunities to do this. The idea is very simple. After making the last stitch, find another stitch of the same or similar color a short distance away and do the tuck-in there instead. The reason behind it is that the thread running underneath the fabric will later be stitched over, giving it additional protection and helping to secure the ending even better. To use this ending method, you need to know in advance that the stitch you're making will be the last one before ending the thread. Here's how it works. First, make the first leg of the stitch normally, so go from bottom left to top right. Then I make the second leg almost normally, but I don't pull the thread all the way through. Instead, I leave a large loop on top of the fabric. Normally pulling the thread would complete the second leg of the stitch, but here I stop and hold that loop with my left hand. At this point, it's very important that the thread tail hides under the fabric. It has to go down under the fabric. The only thing visible on top of the fabric is that loose second leg, which I'm holding with my finger. Now make the first leg of the stitch again, and as you pull the thread down, it also tightens the second leg and everything locks into place automatically. Then I come up a few stitches away and cut the thread. Okay, let's do it one more time. I make the first leg normally, then I make the second leg, but again I don't pull the thread all the way through. I hold this large loop on top of the fabric, making sure that the thread tail stays completely hidden underneath the fabric. Next I make the first leg again, and now give the thread a good tug. First, the new first leg is formed, and then the second leg tightens and locks everything in place. At this point, I can come up a few stitches away and cut the thread. You may be wondering whether this method creates a bulkier stitch since we make the first leg twice. Technically, yes, the stitch would probably be slightly thicker than a regular stitch, but in practice the difference is barely noticeable, if noticeable at all. Now let's take a look at a hidden stitch or slip stitch ending. This type of ending will not work on Aida because of the way the fabric is constructed. It works best on rigid canvas fabrics such as monocanvas. Here I have a great example, Congress Stramin 24 count, which is excellent for 10 stitches. Let me show you how the hidden stitch works. Let's say this is the last stitch and I need to end my thread. We can choose an empty spot nearby and bring the needle up as if we were making another stitch. Then I look closely at the fabric threads in that area. Here I can see that the thread on top runs vertically up and down. Can you see that? So to make a hidden stitch, I also insert my needle vertically parallel to the fabric thread. This creates a vertical stitch. When I pull the thread tight under the fabric, the stitch slips under the warp thread of the canvas. Now it's hidden under the thread, barely visible, and it holds securely because the fabric itself is very stiff. At this point I can bring the needle up somewhere nearby and cut the thread. The thread running from the last stitch to the slip stitch ending will later be stitched over on the back, which gives it additional protection and security. Now let's look at a different situation. After making the last stitch, I come up in another empty space, but this time I can see that the weft thread of the fabric is on top, running horizontally. In this case, I also make a horizontal stitch. Then I give the thread a firm tug so that the stitch slips underneath the horizontal weft thread. After that, I can bring the needle up nearby and cut the thread. There's probably another name for this type of ending, but I know it as a fringe ending. It's not the best option when working with diagonals. It works much better when you stitch your project in blocks. Here I'm making my last stitch, and to end the thread I choose a spot some distance away. I bring the needle up through the fabric, then go back down 2 or 3 stitches away, come up again and cut the end. That leaves us with a little fringe on the surface. If I have another thread to end, I do the same thing next to the previous ending. Then I continue stitching normally. As I work, the new stitches on the back will secure those ending threads underneath the fabric. Later, when I reach that area with the fringes on the front, I can simply pull them out and trim them close to the fabric. You can probably see why this type of ending works best when stitching in blocks. It gives you a clearly defined area where you can end your threads. For example, you might skip 1 or 2 blocks and use the next block as your ending area. Once that block is stitched, you can trim all those loose ends. You can see this type of ending, for example, in videos by Jackie from Esperoart Cross Stitch or Nicola from Simply a Stitcher. I'll link those videos below. So that's everything I've prepared for you today. I hope you found some inspiration and that this video was helpful. Thank you very much for watching and happy stitching. Bye!